Good afternoon, colleagues and professor. My name is Yola. I will be presenting this week. I will be presenting to you two articles. They are both under the bigger topic of validity with two different approaches, but they link together very beautifully. So we will start with article number 1. So the first article is written by Campbell and Fiske, titled Convergent and Discriminant Validation by the Multi-Trait Multi-Method Matrix. So this is a very fundamental article in the literature, and it had a massive impact and contribution to researchers in various domains. However, it's not the easiest to follow through, so I'm just going to go and introduce the bigger keywords that they heavily use in the article. So traits, these are qualitative variables being tested by researchers, and they hope to measure them, such as honesty and academic integrity. While methods, these are the data collection, measurements, and methods used to analyze these traits, such as surveys, interviews, or questionnaires. So discriminant and conversion validation, these are two types of categories that Campbell and Fiske use to organize these methods and be able to give them validity to be able to measure the constructs. So they do that by introducing a mathematical matrix called the multi-trait multi-method matrix, and they use the correlation in order to be able to assess, and then they introduce some rules for these matrices and some patterns to follow through, and then they introduce previous literature that uses these mathematical matrices to analyze and better illustrate their concepts. So, what is convergent and discriminant validation? Convergence is when we expect the data to converge, when we have different methods measuring the same construct, we expect them to have a high correlation because they are measuring the same bigger value. Where on the other hand, discriminant is when we expect different methods measuring different constructs to differ between them and thus have a lower correlation. And just to give a note, discriminant validation is not a negative outcome per se. Sometimes this is the outcome that you expect out of your data. So the first rule that we look for in the data is the independence of methods and traits. So the methods should be completely independent of each other in order to be able to eliminate the variation that comes from them, so we would be able to better assess convergent validity. So when we assess convergent, we look for different methods measuring the same construct, and we expect a high correlation of them. Versus the evaluation of discriminant is when we look for a lower validation or a lower correlation unit when it comes to the methods that we are assessing. So when we say unit or values, what are we looking at? We are looking at a trait method unit. We will be looking at an example of the matrix later on, but each trait measured by a specific method is correlated with another trait measured by another method. Sometimes they could be the same trait and the same method, and their correlation is plotted, but each trait and method is treated as a unit, so that's an individual cell in the matrix. So if we only use one trait and one method, there's going to be a lot of variation that we wouldn't be able to account for. So in order to reduce this variance and be able to draw conclusions that we know are not bound to a lot of error, they introduced the multi-trait, multi-method, that each trait is at least measured by two methods to make sure that we have more validity with our data and we are better assessing this matrix. So this is an example of the matrix that they presented in their article. This specific matrix is measuring three traits, trait A, B, and C, using three different methods. So there is this little box that compares the different traits using the same method. So let's say this diagonal line compares mono method and mono trait. However, this triangle over here is heterotrait but mono method. So now we have to look at the 4 rules that they told us to follow in order to be able to evaluate this data and use it to draw conclusions. The first rule is that the values in each cell or unit is supposed to be different from 0, which is clearly satisfied over here. We don't have any zeros in this specific matrix. The second rule is that any unit that has either a trait or a method in common should be higher than the values that are heterotrait and heteromethod. We can observe this over here with these two triangles. This triangle is heterotrait but monomethod, and it has significantly higher values than this triangle that is heterotrait and heteromethod. So the second rule is observed here as well. And we can even look at this specific example as well, where this diagonal is monotrait but heteromethod compared to these values that are heterotrait and heteromethod, and we can see that the values here are higher. The third rule that seems also obvious, but it's very important to see in our matrix, is that correlation must be higher for traits measured by different methods compared to heterotrait monomethod observations. So this diagonal line over here that is monotrait but heteromethod is clearly more than this triagonal that is heterotrait but monomethod. So this is the third rule that's respected here as well. So the fourth and the last rule is that in the heterotrait triangles, the same patterns should be respected. So if we take this and we fold it along the diagonal line, we can see that these values over here have the same pattern. Same for this one over here. Same for this one over here. So if we see an oddly different pattern in these little triangles, this is a big fault in our matrix. So these are the 4 patterns that must be respected in order to be able to draw conclusions from our matrix. So this is an example from literature. It is from Berwin and Campbell in 1957. They presented this research, and their hypothesis was to test if there's an attitude change when you are dealing with authority versus non-authority figures. So they used 2 methods, interview and trait checklist, and they have 3 traits. These traits are father, boss, and peer, and they classified father and boss as authority figures. So as you can see over here in the matrix, when we look at this specific cell that compares boss to father, you can see that the correlation is very high, which means the attitude is very correlated between the father and the boss, which proves that there is convergence validity in this research. However, in this case, for the purpose of their hypothesis, they would expect a discriminant validation when it comes to peer and boss or peer and father, because these are considered the non-authority figures and they wouldn't supposed to correlate highly. But they observed this over here with a very high correlation, even bigger than the boss and father correlation, which quickly invalidated the hypothesis and the measures that they are using. However, this doesn't mean that this is the end of their research. It opens a lot of doors for different hypotheses and different modifications of their construct. So I would like to highlight the importance of this article. This article presented a quantitative approach to a very abstract and qualitative traits. So this is massively used in psychological, management, and marketing research, and they used a mathematical matrix to validate these methods, and they provided 2 big categories, which are the convergence and the discriminant validity. But what really is important in this research is that they did not stop the research in case the validity was not met. So they opened the door for a lot of conceptual development in the methods and the constructs in case the validity was not achieved at the first try, as we saw in the last example. So in the last example, when the discriminant validity was not observed when it was supposed to, that doesn't mean that the construct is completely invalid. It means maybe they have to reassess their traits, maybe they have to reconsider what is considered authority versus non-authority. So this is not like the end block to the research, but this rather opens the door for a more open discussion about the actual constructs. Now for the personal criticism of this article. So regardless of the massive impact this article had on the literature and the validity community, it just, when I first read it, the introduction was very not clear. They did not really highlight the bigger definitions. They did not explain the problem. They did not explain the gap. They did not give the bigger picture. So you kind of had to dive in right through the numbers and right through the keywords that they used without the introduction of the major keywords, which made it a lot harder to transition from one paragraph versus the other. Even in the understanding of the rules of the matrix, it was like decoding them. Regardless of the brilliant ideas that they presented, it was not presented in a reader-friendly manner or language. The other thing is that the matrix introduced um, the concept of absolute independence between the values and the methods. But we do know that in real life, the achieving the absolutely independent methods and traits is extremely hard, and I'm not sure if it's very realistic to um, demand that from your researcher. So I do believe that this matrix is just going to present relative validity in contrast to the absolute independence validity that they're looking for. And the fourth and last thing is that this matrix did not really give a lot of light on the negative correlation that could be there, on the inverse relationship, and what does that mean in terms of conceptualizing and understanding and relating to the actual construct, because we know that even though the numbers are going to be negative, what does that translate into in our construct and our hypothesis? So I just don't think they gave enough information about the inverse relationship and the negative correlation and how to interpret that in our data. So the second article is titled A Paradigm for Developing Better Measures of Marketing Constructs. It's written by Gilbert and Churchill. They start by highlighting the gap in the marketing research that is between the need to develop better measures to build better constructs and the obstacles that researchers are facing to accomplish that. They also emphasize the need to have more reliable and valid properties of these constructs. And in order to do that, they represent a step-by-step procedure that will facilitate the validation of methodology and thus introduce a new, better valid constructs. The authors quoted Jacobi in his 1978 article, where he puts the blame on marketers for using uncritical approaches to present their measures instead of using more standardized measurement criteria, such as validity, reliability, and sensibility. And he proceeded to say that we cannot really blame having wrong conclusions where the data collection instruments or methods are generating uh, fault data, which means his idea is that we should focus more on validity in order to be able to validate our methods, to have more confidence in our conclusions. And then the authors go ahead and compare the marketing rough patch and the research that's happening to the dilemma that happened in psychology research presented by Trayon in 1957, when he says psychological research faces a lot of problems in finding the reliability of newly introduced methods, which can we really relate to in the marketing research, because they both deal with very abstract qualitative values. And then the authors provide this equation. It's a very simple equation that they summarize the errors and the data that we expect out of our research. They simply say that XO is the value that we get out of our measurements. So this is the outcome that researchers observe when they do a measurement. where xt is the true measure of the construct, which is the value that all researchers hope and wish to find in the research. However, this value is hindered by xs and xr, which xs is the systematic sources of error, so these are the more adjustable sources of error, versus xr, which is the completely random sources of error. And they state that the validity is only observed and obtained when x0, the outcome outside of your methods, is equal to the true measure of the construct, which is xt. However, they proceed to define reliability as the absence of the random sources of error. So when our XR is 0, that means our method is reliable. And reliability is extremely important. However, it's not enough for obtaining validity because there's still systematic errors that need to be adjusted and worked on in order to get the full construct validity that every researcher hopes to find. Then the article presents this 8-step procedure, step-by-step, more of a feedback loop, more interactive, dynamic procedure that they presented, and it consists of 8 steps that we'll be going in detail into. So the first step is to specify the domain of the construct, which means researchers should spend an extra time into conceptualizing their definition of their construct. It has to be clear, exact, and very precise, which will help them have a more clear path in their data collection and their understanding of their research. Step number 2 is to generate sample of items, which is the collection of items, traits, methods, and questionnaires and research questions to be asked in these methods. So they have to spend a lot of time into making the items very clear, with no ambiguous questions, with no double understanding of the meaning of these questions. Then step number 3 is the collection of primary data, at which the more data we have, the more certain we are. Then this leads us to step number 4, which is the purification of the measure. So these data have to be purified, and we have to look at article number 1 to look at how they purified this data through the multi-method, multi-trait matrix. So they use this matrix here as well into looking at the correlation coefficients that we obtained. So because these items are supposed to measure the same construct, we are hoping for a higher intercorrelation between these values. And if this high intercorrelation is not found, we have to dig further to understand which items we have to eliminate and which ones we are supposed to keep. Another mathematical value that researchers should take into account is the coefficient alpha, which is directly related to the coefficient of correlation. So we are hoping for a higher coefficient alpha because we would expect our values to be intercorrelated. The third value that researchers look at is the factor analysis, which is a number of dimensions found in our construct, which is very important to analyze because we have to make sure that all layers of our construct are covered and researched through. So this step is going to help us eliminate all the items that do not serve our construct. Then step number 5 is the iteration and the reassessment of the measures, which more data is collected. So step number 6 would be assessing the reliability of the new data. So this is the reassessment of the data that we collected. So we have to relook at the correlation coefficients and coefficient alpha, and we have to see which items are lowering our correlation by the process of elimination, and we will be able to eliminate the error generating items, which means we are lowering our XR, so we are moving towards a more reliable set of methods and items. Step number 7 is the assessment of the construct validity. So up until now, we have used the matrix to look into the correlation, and we also looked at coefficient alpha to understand which measures are reliable. So we looked a lot at reliability, but we still did not determine the validity. So this is where the research in Article 1 comes very heavily into play. So the Campbell and Fiske article is extremely used in this specific step where the convergent and discriminant validity is looked at and determined. However, they do introduce another step in the validity, which is relating our variables directly to our exact construct. So by doing that, we make sure that our data that we collected and the correlations are directly correlated to our exact construct. So we do that by comparing two constructs that are related, and then we look at their variables and we are hoping for the variables to correlate, which is another step of validity that they added in this research to make sure that there's no randomness in the generation of this conclusion. Then there is step number 8, which is the final step. It's developing the norms. So it is more of a standardization step to make sure that these values are better understood and interpreted by the readers, which means we compare our values to the normal or the average standard variables that are found into the literature. So this is step number 8 and the final step in the procedure. Now for the negatives of this article, I will start by the very obvious one, the numerical values, like coefficient alpha or the correlation coefficient. These are a lot of numerical values, yet there was no numerical range that is given to researchers to understand what does the term big and small mean when it comes to values. The second thing is the factor analysis that is done in the purification of the measures. So the factor analysis will help researchers to understand the different dimensions of their construct. I just do not believe that factor analysis belongs to this step. I do believe it should be in step number 2, which is the generation of the items, because generation of the items should cover all the layers and the dimensions of your construct, and doing the factor analysis there would save researchers a lot of valuable time. For the third thing is they gave us a lot of tips on how to lower XR, the random sources of error, which will get us closer to being reliable, but they kind of skipped over the systematic error because they did not give any tips on how to better the methods, how to better the data collection steps, how to better any step that has data collection. They kind of give a very brief explanation as if the data collection step is a one dimension when there's no error, but we all know that this step could have massive impact on the sources of error. So there's a lot of steps that should be taken into account, and I would really appreciate if they given any examples, any tips on how to better the systematic sources of error, and that would really help researchers in saving a lot of time as well. So the very last step is when they related construct A and B in the very last step of the validation. Like the term relate is very, very general. And again, I do believe if they gave like maybe some type of example on the type of relationship, are they expecting inverse relationship or a direct relationship? And how is that going to reflect on the correlation that we are expecting out of these variables for these constructs? So again, I do believe they did a great job overall. I just hope they gave a lot more practical examples just to make sure that researchers understand where are they coming from with all these general concepts. So thank you everyone for listening to me. I hope this wasn't too long. It's just the articles were very dense. And if you have any questions, they are more than encouraged. Thank you.